Sean Saunders here, and I want to tell you thank you again for allocating time to deepen your own study of Scripture. I have been giving the task of talking about homiletics, and by now I hope you know that hermeneutics is the study of sermons, right? The study that sermons require. Homiletics is the style of the sermon, right? And both study and style are important if you want to be an effective communicator. So I have the task of differentiating for you just a few things you need to consider as it relates to homiletics. If you're ready, let's get started. So homiletics is the art of preaching. The same way that there's an art of singing, there's an art of preaching, which means there's a certain component and style and flavor to what you do. Sometimes you may see Joel Osteen and you'll see Joyce Meyer. And one of the mistakes I think we've made, especially in the Black church, is that we have connected talking with teaching and hooping with preaching. I want to blow that up from inception. That is inaccurate and it is not theologically sound. Preaching is for the unbeliever. Teaching is for the disciple. So neither preaching or teaching has anything to do with style. It is possible for you to hoop, and your hoop or your demonstration or your style only speaks to the unbeliever based on the content of your sermon. So the sermon's content determines if it's preaching or teaching. And I think effective communication, particularly when you're preaching on a Sunday, should do both, because you're going to have populated in your church or online people who are new to the faith and people who have been in the faith for a while. So great preaching and great teaching does both. We also communicate to the unbeliever while simultaneously feeding the disciple. And that is my prayer, that you will see homiletics not just as a style, but as an art, because the art allows you to make it better. The next thing I want you to know about hermeneutics, because people ask all the time, well, what's the difference? Exegesis, you've already taken. Hermeneutics, you've already taken. But I will say for you, in my opinion, the exegesis, the exegetical work of a sermon is the who, the what, the where, the when, and the why. Who is speaking? What is happening? Who around the speaker does this message particularly and directly speak to? And why is it important? Not for me, but for the people in that space, right? Exegesis asks those hard questions. And I believe that hermeneutics, the art of interpretation, is also another way for you to study the necessary ingredients before you actually prepare the sermon. Said better, hermeneutics is laying out the cucumbers, the pasta, the tomatoes, the oil and vinegar or the Italian dressing, the salt and pepper before you make the pasta salad. And after you have the ingredients, then you can actually put them together. And homiletics is the putting of them together. Do I put this first and this second? Why? Do I boil the water first or do I put oil in the pot? All of those are the order of the things that you prepare. Does that make sense? Every analogy that I give is going to have something to do with food because I'm always hungry. All right, so that's homiletics. Homiletics is the art of preaching. Hermeneutics is about discovering scientifically the original intended meaning of a text. And I want you to be clear that a lot of times we do that wrong. There's this book that I told you about in my lecture on Old Testament that I am committed to because I read it on a consistent basis to check my own lenses. That's how one pastor defines hermeneutics, your lenses. Because all of us have different lenses. If you can't see, you have a different prescription. And if I had a gloss of red, everything that I saw outside of these glasses would look like what I'm seeing because of my lens. So depending on your lens, sometimes we can make the mistake of taking scripture out of context, which is why this book called Misreading Scripture from a Western Context is an important one for you to consider because it helps you to differentiate the common words that we use from the words that were used in the Bible. For example, just recently, I heard a lecture about what it meant to be the salt and light of the world. Salt was not just a part of seasoning. The salt that people got from the shore was a preservative, and it also cleansed when they had to use the bathroom outside. There were no toilets. And so salt was one of the ways in which some of the toxins and some of the contaminants were absolved and absorbed. And when we make the mistake of always using our terminologies with antiquated texts, we miss a major part of Revelation. Another thing that I think misreading scripture through Western eyes taught me was how we look at famine. Because of our American context, I don't know that many of us, unless you were a farmer as a kid, know what it's like to depend on agriculture so that you can have money in the bank. And so when we listen to the story of the prodigal son and we see various components, very few American Christians will lean into the famine in the land because famine is not something that we actually connect to on a consistent basis. But if you were to travel on the other side of the world, or maybe go to the middle of the country, and they talked about famine, they may be able to have a different interpretation. So my goal is to help you to see that reading scripture through the lenses of its intended audience and then asking the necessary questions are important if you're going to have an effective sermon. So I stopped asking, what is this scripture trying to tell me? And I start asking, what is this scripture trying to tell the people for whom it was originally intended? Because when we forget that we were not the original content specific audience, then we actually perform arrogant hubris, assuming that the world revolves around us and not the other way around. So what are some clear steps about preparing a sermon? This is what I want you to write down. Number one, you can't just pray. You've got to study. Timothy says, study to show thyself approved unto God, a workman that needs not be ashamed. And as you're dividing and as you are deciding on your style of preaching, I want you to be open to various forms. I want you to list your top 3 preachers and tell me why. And I don't want you to just talk about their way of preaching. I want you to tell me how they lay out a sermon. There are various types of theology and various reasons that sermons actually preach. Right? You have moral theology. That's the do's and the don'ts. You have ecclesiology. That's how the church is to be constructed. Often you see Paul writing in letters from an ecclesiological perspective so that there's an order and a regulation for how church should go. And then there's pastoral theology. You have liturgy, you have Christian education, you have Christian counseling. And pastoral theology is concerned about pastoring the people. So of course it needs a different kind of lens. And then you have missiology, the mission of God as it relates to the world. Don't forget that God never told the disciples, Jesus never said to the disciples, come and make members. He said, go and make disciples. So what is the difference between a couple of sermons? I'll give you 5 types of sermons just for you to get started, and then we can follow up with some additional nuanced sermons at a later time. So what are different types of sermons? I'll give you 5 easy ones that I think are nomenclature in preaching, and then at another time we can talk about some subaltern topics. But some of the most famous types of sermons that exist. First, you have a textual sermon. Write that down. A textual sermon is an analysis of a specific scripture for use in a word-for-word study. So when somebody takes a text and they analyze a specific scripture, they are able to use that to promulgate a certain conclusion. So if I want to talk about love and I pull out 1 Corinthians 13th chapter, I'll look at all the components of love and then I'll make some conclusions around it to communicate a desire. But that is very different than expository sermons. An exposition, if you look at that, even outside of religious context, an exposition is a comprehensive analysis of larger blocks of scripture so that the bigger picture can be understood. Now, in my informal training, we used to do something called cherry picking. My grandfather used to teach us, whenever I want to teach you about love, look at every scripture on love and then find out what the big deal is. Now that I've evolved, I know that scripture should confirm scripture. So when I want to make a conclusion about God, I need to find at least 2 to 3 other examples where that is true so that I am not taking one scripture out of context and then making it a conclusive argument about the whole scripture. And I can give you some examples, but what I will do, instead of giving them to you, I'll show you examples of effective expository preaching. And if you are only surrounding yourself with people who think and speak like you, you're not growing. So my challenge to you is to actually embrace even particular topical ways of preaching or allegorical ways of preaching that may be unfamiliar to you, because you become a better preacher when you stretch yourself. One of Cleophas LaRue's additional tenets for preaching was narrative. Consistent in Black church preaching is a narrative sermon where you are not actually given 3 points and a hoop, right? You're given a whole story, and instead of me telling you what to take away from it, I'm giving you a narrative sermon that you can apply in your own life. That's very similar to the parables of Jesus. He tells a story and leaves it to the reader to walk away with their conclusions. If you have any questions about homiletics, I'd be glad to help you, and I'd be glad to look at your sermons. But for now, I want you to practice as many different kinds of ways to communicate the gospel, because if we're going to be effective in ministry, we can't just speak the way we know how to speak. We've got to be open to other ways of understanding. I pray this lecture bless you, and I'll be glad to answer any questions if you have them.